So the next part of this chapter is membrane transport. Membrane transport is an essential function of the plasma membrane and the proteins embedded in the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane, if you remember, is amphipathic in nature. It has a polar head and a lipid tail. So these are phospholipid molecules that make up a bilayer of the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is selectively permeable, meaning only some materials can pass through while other materials are excluded from the plasma membrane. For example, carbon dioxide and oxygen can easily pass through the plasma membrane because they are smaller molecules. However, bigger molecules like a glucose molecule cannot just pass through the plasma membrane. Glucose molecules require a special carrier to be taken into the cell. And other undesirable materials that are not required in the cell are kept out of the cell. So before we move further into membrane transport, you need to understand what a solution is. A solution is a mixture of two or more substances, and the substance being dissolved is the solute, and the substance in which the solute is dissolved is the solvent. So in a solution of sugar and water, sugar is the solute and water is the solvent. So make sure you understand the difference before you move on. If not, you might find the membrane transport system very confusing. So solute is the component being dissolved in a bigger volume of another substance like water or milk, right? So solute is the salt or sugar and water is the solvent. And solution is a homogeneous mixture of the solute in a solvent. So the plasma membrane is selectively permeable barrier. So only some materials can pass through while others are excluded. So it selects what needs to pass through, and for this purpose they have sensors or receptors on the surface of plasma membrane. A lot of times these receptors are in form of proteins on the surface of plasma membrane. So this is just a movie on membrane transport process. I'm hoping it plays this time. So let's see. So that video doesn't want to play right now, so I'll try it just in a few seconds. Two basic methods of membrane transport include the passive process and an active process. A passive transport mechanism is the type of transport that requires absolutely no energy from the cell, so it does not require ATP for the process. Usually in passive processes, molecules move from an area of higher solute concentration to a lower solute concentration. So they move down the gradient. Just take an example of, somebody trying to push a rock on a hill. So if you want to push this rock over the hill, just towards the hill, you're going to use a lot of energy. So this type of process is known as an active process because you need a lot of energy to push this big rock up the hill. But in a passive transport process, the rock is being pushed down the hill. So the rock will just roll down the hill with not really much input from you, because it's gonna roll down the hill without energy input from you. So this type of process is known as passive process. So active processes require ATP, and passive transport require no ATP. Okay, so make sure you're very clear with this difference. Passive does not require energy. Active processes require active energy from the cell in the form of ATP. Okay. So this is the movie on membrane transport. Oops.
In order for us to use the molecules and energy we get from food, we must transport them across cell membranes. Transport of nutrients is essential for all cells, but we'll use cells in the small intestine to teach the principles of membrane transport. Let's zoom into the surface of an intestinal cell. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable. Some molecules can move across it, while others cannot. How do materials enter and leave cells? Lipids, such as these yellow molecules, can move freely across the lipid bilayer. Notice that the lipid molecules move down their concentration gradient from where they are more concentrated to where they are less concentrated. This is an example of simple diffusion. Diffusion is a form of passive transport. It does not require energy from the cell, but it does depend on the concentration gradient, size and charge of the molecule or ion. However, most molecules cannot cross the lipid bilayer. Instead, molecules like the sugar fructose move into intestinal cells by facilitated diffusion, moving down their concentration gradient and through transport proteins. It also differs because it acts only on specific molecules, and the transport proteins can become saturated, reducing the amount of diffusion. However, facilitated diffusion doesn't require energy from the cell, so, like simple diffusion, it's a form of passive transport. The majority of water molecules cross the plasma membrane by facilitated diffusion, also called osmosis, through specific protein channels called aquaporins. Some ions, such as sodium and potassium, require transport against their concentration gradients. The sodium-potassium pump actively transports these ions from where they are less concentrated to where they are more concentrated. This process requires energy from the cell and is known as active transport. Energy from ATP is used to move 3 sodium ions, shown in red, out of the cell, and 2 potassium ions, shown in blue, into the cell. Because the pump uses ATP directly, this type of transport is called primary active transport. Another type of active transport, secondary active transport, also moves chemicals against gradients. It doesn't use ATP as a direct source of energy. Instead, it uses the downhill gradient from one ion or molecule to drive the uphill movement of another ion or molecule. For example, sodium and glucose move into the cell by secondary active transport in a process called cotransport or symport, because both substances are moving in the same direction. Sodium ions move down their concentration gradient created by the sodium-potassium pump, but because glucose concentrations inside the cell can quickly exceed those outside the cell, glucose moves against its concentration gradient. The cell moves larger materials, such as proteins, from the intracellular fluid to the extracellular fluid, using vesicles that fuse with the plasma membrane and release their contents outside the cell. This process is called exocytosis. In endocytosis, the plasma membrane pinches in, forming a vesicle that contains material from outside the cell. Cells use all these processes, passive and active transport, exocytosis and endocytosis, to move materials across their membranes.
So that video gave you an overview of membrane transport. If you would like to look at the video again, it should be a part of your lecture notes. So let's look at all these transport mechanisms individually. The first transport mechanism is the passive process, which does not require energy. So there are two main types of passive transport processes in physiology. The first one is diffusion, the second one is filtration. Now, diffusion is merely the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentrations. Keep in mind that you're pushing the rock down the hill from high to low. So in this process, you do not require any energy. The kinetic energy of the molecule just causes the molecules to move around randomly until both sides of the plasma membrane have attained equilibrium, that is the same concentration. Let's take a very simple example of diffusion. When you open an air freshener in the corner of the room, initially just the corner of the room is concentrated, but eventually the air freshener molecules spread around the room by the process of diffusion. And another example is this tablet in here that has purple dye. Initially it's concentrated just to the tablet. When you drop the tablet in water, it dissolves and gets distributed evenly around the solvent, which is water. So this process is known as passive transport, specifically diffusion. So there are several factors that influence passive transport. First is the size of the molecule. The second is the temperature that affect the rate of diffusion. Just imagine a bigger molecule is going to be heavier to move around, right? So a bigger molecule moves very slowly. So larger the molecule, slower the process of diffusion process. And then temperature. At a slower temperature, molecules move slowly because they have lower kinetic energy, but a higher temperature increases the kinetic energy of molecules, which increases the rate of diffusion. So molecules will move by diffusion if any of the following applies. First, the molecules are small enough to pass through the membrane. Keep in mind the bilipid layer, which is made of phospholipids. They are selectively permeable, so they do not allow molecules to just pass through very easily. If the molecule is small enough, for example, oxygen or carbon dioxide, they can simply pass through the plasma membrane. If not, they need specific channels formed by membrane proteins. For example, water molecules can pass through aquaporins, which are membrane proteins for specifically carrying water in and out of the cell. Now, small lipid molecules are easily soluble because the lipid tail is nonpolar, which is made up of lipid, so they can easily pass through if they are small enough. Then the molecules assisted by a membrane carrier can also pass through very easily. So there are several types of diffusion. First one is simple diffusion, which is an unassisted process. They can simply move in and out of the plasma membrane, for example, lipid soluble solutes. So simple diffusion again does not require ATP. And molecules can simply pass through the plasma membrane because lipid molecules that are small enough are just going to sneak through the phospholipid bilayer and enter the cytoplasm. And that's why, benzene, earlier people never used to use gloves for handling benzene, and then they realized benzene is highly nonpolar and it can easily pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. So then on, they realized that benzene can be toxic, and they suggested wearing gloves while handling benzene in the lab. Now, the movement of water specifically is known as the process of osmosis. Okay, so osmosis is simple diffusion of water specifically through a selectively permeable membrane. So water always moves down its concentration gradient. So here we're talking about movement of water from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. So highly polar molecule, water is a highly polar molecule which can easily cross the plasma membrane, but they use specific carriers known as aquaporins. These are protein channels that allow the passage of water through the semi-permeable membrane. Okay, so these are water molecules, and this protein over here is known as aquaporin. Aquaporins are channels that allow the passage of water specifically. And water, keep in mind, always moves down its concentration gradient. So water moves from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. Okay, when I say concentration gradient, I mean that a spectrum from low to high concentration or high to low concentration of a particular substance. So the difference in concentration of solutes on both sides of the plasma membrane can cause something called as a concentration gradient. So the process of osmosis is really important in biological processes like red blood cells, right? If any of you have ever worked, say in a hospital or in a nursing home, they specifically provide 0.9% saline solution. And that's what it is. I mean, 0.9% saline is used in every, in every hospital. You don't use 10% saline, and you don't use distilled water to give a patient, right? Because if the water concentration is higher and lower than in 0.9% saline, the blood cells get affected and the tissues get affected. Okay, so let's take a closer look at osmosis.